U.S. History, Lesson 38, The Ordeal of Lyndon Johnson and the Crisis in the 1960s. An awful lot of what you as students and American popular culture in general considers to be quote-unquote the 60s. All the stuff that is the Forrest Gump film that many of you have seen or can see on TV, that era is really not truly the 60s. It is more accurately probably portrayed as about 1965 through 1975, being representing that compression of events and things. But we're going to focus for this lesson on the first half of that. We're going to look at the late 60s, or the mid to late 60s of Lyndon Johnson, and we'll transfer the post-1970 part of this era into some of the activities of Richard Nixon and American society during that time. But beginning with Lyndon Johnson's arrival into the White House with Kennedy's assassination, we see that Lyndon Johnson wants to maintain and actually advance many of Kennedy's policies, and he's probably better equipped to do it. Formerly, he'd been the Senate Majority Leader and was a master political infighter. And there were things that he wanted to do in his own right as well. Lyndon Johnson, in his political DNA, had always said that Franklin D. Roosevelt was his political daddy. And what he meant by that was that he wanted to out-New Deal the New Deal if he could ever get in a position where he could use government as a force to help people and help impact their lives in positive ways. And particularly the downtrodden, the poor, rural Americans, he wanted to provide government as a force to sort of elevate the national state, elevate the national consciousness, elevate the national standard of living, the national way of life. And so, in many ways, the Great Society of the 1960s, his programs, represents the pinnacle, the high point of big government liberal activism in the 20th century. He came into office pursuing what his version of what the New Deal was going to be was called the Great Society. And the key element of this was the programs he wanted to set up for the needy and the poor, known as the War on Poverty. To do some of this, he was going to further go along with policies that Kennedy had pushed on the taxation. He also had the Tax Reduction Act of 1964, similar to the policies that Kennedy had championed, getting more money into people's hands. However, at the same time that he was stimulating the economy this way, he was boosting government spending. This boosting it domestically, plus foreign policy boosting on Vietnam, is going to overheat the economy and lead to some real negative economic conditions by the late 60s and 1970s. Deficit spending, stagflation, inflation in the economy, stagnant economy. We'll all get there soon enough. But right now we're on the high side, or on the rising side of what he was doing. In 64 and 65, 66, the American people were all for an awful lot of these Great Society programs that Johnson was championing. And like the New Deal, like the Progressive Era, it's important for you to realize Johnson is not operating in a vacuum in any way. LBJ's ideas for domestic policy, they really represent a continuation of a long-running liberal branch of American political thought. We've seen the pendulum swing. Our pendulum is still with that swing. We've seen ideas of the Progressive Era show up, then get repressed, then show up again in the New Deal, and then those same ideas show up and repressed and get showed up again in the Great Society. Things such as the Office of Economic Opportunity. It establishes a Job Corps program, allows for workplace and job training for young Americans and poor Americans to get them into the economy in many ways. Volunteers to Service in America, VISTA as it was called, sort of set up in many ways a domestic Peace Corps, sets up an opportunity for Americans to, as volunteers, to help work in poverty-stricken America. Medicaid and Medicare were going to be programs that were going to provide medical care for senior citizens. Medicaid was going to provide medical care for the indigent and poor as big major augmentations to Social Security and the Social Security programs in many ways. You were also seeing food stamps as a concept come out of this era as well, trying to lighten the burden on the lower classes, on the elderly. Elementary and Secondary Education Act was going to pour major federal dollars into programs, both state and federal programs for education, creates the Head Start program to give disadvantaged youth an opportunity to kind of make sure they can continue with their schooling on a level playing field with the rest of America. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Some new cabinet departments get established during this point in time. Housing and Urban Development is going to set up for public housing, going to try to give housing needs and housing opportunities, get them accurately gauged throughout the nation, allocation of resources for housing of people that were going to get their first homes or get public housing and apartment to get them out of their very negative situation of having housing needs really not met on a large scale for the forgotten Americans, if you will. Department of Transportation, similar kind of thing, was going to set up highway and urban planning and also rural planning as well in terms of mass transit, construction policies. A lot of money was going to go into this like earlier New Deal programs. And the idea was to also have safety on gas pipelines and waterways and harbors and ports to really try to kind of consolidate and bring together many of the transportation things that we'd seen from the Eisenhower Interstate National Defense Act, from New Deal public works programs, from Henry Clay's American system, if you want to go all the way that far back, integrate the country, put Americans to work in the process of doing that, and also help get a lot of governmental regional systemic planning in place to have the government act as an active economic and regional manager, if you will. So they were for an awful lot of things, they were against very few, was sort of the running joke of the time for the Great Society. Now, we'd also seen this undercurrent, and this in the late 20th century, you're seeing it in your textbooks probably as well. It might frustrate you some as students. Your textbooks sometimes start to get thematic. You've had chapters that were going chronologically through the time periods, and then all of a sudden you get a chapter that it's, let's talk civil rights, 1945 to 1970, and then let's talk foreign policy, 1945 to 1970. Some of your books are set up like that, and it might kind of throw you off after saying, well, we've been going through the decades, and now I'm doing this. I've kind of done a blend of both of them for you because once again now we're going to talk about that undercurrent. What was the undercurrent that was becoming too big to ignore, that was going to be pushing itself into one of the dominant topics of discussion in American domestic policy by the 60s? That topic was civil rights. We'd seen civil rights as a component of the Kennedy administration. We'd seen it as a component in our lessons on the Eisenhower administration, the Truman administration, and this is where it really comes to the fore and becomes not a component, but in many ways the component, or one of the 2 to 3 big components of the real era. One of the great ironies of the civil rights movement is that just when the movement was on the cusp, on the verge of getting all the things it had struggled and sought for in a nonviolent manner, all through the 50s and 60s, just when it sought to get those things, it was realizing those gains, was when the movement began to fracture, to splinter, and actually radicalize, and elements of the movement began to turn violent. But the pinnacle for the first phase of the movement would have been the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Civil Rights Act of 64 outlaws the poll tax. In other words, there's a requirement for presidential election. You can no longer be required to pay a fee. And the Voting Rights Act of 65 makes it illegal to discriminate in voting and suppress voting and in voting registration. The Freedom Summer activities of 1964, what you'd seen there was Northern black and white activists, like those who'd been working with SNCC, like those who'd been working with Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, like those who'd been working with SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Northern black and white activists and advocates began heading south in order to register blacks to vote. And needless to say, this is not always well received, and this is when you see the Klan and white citizens councils showing up, actively fighting and resisting, and in some cases beating or murdering these activists. You see John Kennedy and his Attorney General, his Justice Department worked actively to sort of, over time, gradually diminish this sort of violence and gradually, not as quick as the civil rights activists wanted it, integrate these kinds of equality measures into the fabric of the South. Lyndon Johnson is going to continue that. And Lyndon Johnson is a Texan. He's a Democrat. He's a Southerner. He's a Southern Democrat. And he's going to advocate this because he sees it as being the right thing to do. But he says and signed these 2 laws. We're going to do what the right thing is to do, but I'm going to lose the Democratic Party to the South for a generation. And he was right, because it's beginning with the 64 election of Johnson versus Goldwater. You see the flip. You see the southern states begin voting for Republicans or independent candidates who represent a more reactionary conservative view on civil rights and social issues, as opposed to the Democratic Party, which seems to be moving in these new directions that this region does not want to go into.